The fire started before sunrise. An Iranian drone crossed the Gulf of Oman and slammed into the Fujairah oil terminal, the single port the United Arab Emirates uses to export oil without touching the Strait of Hormuz. It was not a near miss. It ignited. 3 workers were pulled from the facility, all Indian nationals, all wounded. This was not a skirmish at sea. This was Iran striking a land target on a U.S. ally's soil for the second consecutive day during a ceasefire that everyone in Washington is insisting is still in effect. And here is the question that should be keeping every analyst in the world awake tonight. Iran's own chief negotiator just told the world, in public, that they have not even begun yet. What you just heard is not a prediction. It is not an analyst's warning. Those are the words of Mohammad Bagher Qalibaf, Iran's parliament speaker, Iran's lead negotiator in the ceasefire talks, writing publicly that everything the world has witnessed in the last 48 hours is Iran holding back. This is the Jang report. I'm going to give you the full picture of what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz, and more importantly, what it means for you, for global oil prices, and for the question of whether the world is 3 bad days away from a conflict that cannot be contained. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 things that almost no one is covering. First, why the ceasefire's biggest problem is not the military exchanges. It is a single line in Iran's negotiating position that makes a deal structurally nearly impossible. Second, why the US and Iran are giving completely contradictory accounts of the same military event on the same day, and why that matters far more than the event itself. And third, what the World Food Program just revealed about the civilian cost of this crisis that dwarfs everything happening in the Strait. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. This is moving fast. Now let's get into exactly what happened and when. The timeline begins on Sunday, May 3rd. President Trump announced Project Freedom, a U.S. military operation to escort stranded merchant ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The announcement was framed as defensive. The U.S. Navy, supported by more than 100 military aircraft, would create a protected corridor through Omani territorial waters in the southern lane of the strait, away from Iran's Northern Revolutionary Guard corridor. Monday, May 4th. U.S. Central Command activated the operation. 2 American-flagged merchant ships began their transit. One of them was the Alliance Fairfax, a Maersk vessel that had been stranded in the Persian Gulf since the war began on February 28th. CENTCOM Chief Admiral Bradley Cooper reported that the U.S. military engaged and destroyed 6 small Iranian boats that had targeted commercial vessels under U.S. protection. He confirmed Iran also launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small boats at U.S. Navy ships and commercial vessels. A South Korean cargo ship sustained damage in the exchange, the only vessel hit, according to U.S. officials. That same evening, Iran struck the UAE, 15 missiles and 4 drones, according to UAE defense officials. 1 drone broke through and hit the Fujairah Oil Industry Zone, igniting a fire and wounding 3 Indian nationals. Fujairah is not just any port. It is the UAE's sole major sea access point that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz entirely. That choice of target was not accidental. By Tuesday morning, May the 5th, Trump refused to confirm whether the ceasefire remained in effect. CENTCOM declined to answer the same question. Then, Tuesday evening, Trump reversed direction entirely, announcing he had paused Project Freedom to finalize a deal, while keeping the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports in place. In under 48 hours, the U.S. launched an operation, fought Iran at sea, watched an ally's oil infrastructure burn, and then stopped the operation it had just started. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you need to go back to February 28, 2026. That is when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The strikes were devastating. The U.S. later claimed it had decimated Iran's nuclear capabilities. Satellite imagery, however, told a more complicated story. Some of what was claimed destroyed appeared to have survived. Iran's immediate response was to close the Strait of Hormuz. Not with mines alone, though mines were part of it. Reports emerged that Iran had lost track of some mines it planted in the strait, meaning it could not fully reopen it even if it wanted to. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved to control all shipping through the strait's northern corridor. Any vessel wanting to pass had to be vetted by the IRGC and pay a toll, in some cases over $1 million per ship. The economic consequences were immediate and global. Oil prices surged. Major shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all strait transits. Before the war, roughly 120 ships passed through the strait daily. That number collapsed to near zero. A ceasefire was negotiated on April 8th. It appeared to be a breakthrough. Iran's foreign minister publicly declared the strait open to all commercial traffic for the duration of the truce. Oil prices dropped sharply, 11% in the immediate aftermath. But the opening was a fiction. Within days, Iran was again restricting and conditioning all traffic. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's CEO confirmed publicly that 230 loaded oil tankers were still anchored inside the Gulf, unable to move. The Islamabad peace talks collapsed April 12th. The U.S. responded April 13th by imposing a naval blockade of Iranian ports, blocking Iran's oil export revenue. The negotiations moved to passing messages through Pakistan, then through back channels, then apparently to nothing. Iran's foreign minister announced he was heading to Beijing on Wednesday, May 6th, to seek China's involvement. That is the full arc of how we arrived here. Not as an accident, as the predictable endpoint of 3 months of escalation, failed diplomacy, and two sides maneuvering toward a confrontation neither can fully control. Here is what you now know. Both sides are calling this a ceasefire. Both sides are also shooting at each other. And Iran's parliament speaker, the man sitting across the negotiating table from Washington, just told the world publicly that his country has not yet fully responded. That statement changes everything you just heard, because it means Iran has a larger play in mind, and we do not yet know what it is. If this story matters to you, and after what comes next it will, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part. Donald Trump is in the most exposed position of anyone in this crisis. He launched Project Freedom on Sunday, framed it as a historic operation to restore free shipping, watched it spark the most intense military exchange since the ceasefire, and then paused it the same evening he launched it, citing deal progress. There is no public evidence of what that progress consists of. Trump told Fox News that Iranian forces who targeted U.S. ships would be blown off the face of the earth. Hours later, his administration confirmed the ceasefire was still intact. What Trump wants is clear, a nuclear deal that allows him to declare victory. What he is willing to do to get there is the open question. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has taken on the public-facing role of defining what the ceasefire means. His position is that the U.S. can escort civilian ships, sink Iranian military boats, and call all of it defensive, while simultaneously insisting the April 8th truce has not ended. Rubio also made the unusually candid statement that thousands of civilian sailors stranded in the Gulf are sitting ducks, isolated, starving, vulnerable. That is not diplomatic language. That is someone describing a humanitarian crisis while asking the world to believe a ceasefire is in effect. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi warned publicly that the U.S. and UAE were risking being dragged into a quagmire. He also said negotiations with Washington were making progress with Pakistan's gracious effort. That is the diplomatic face. Then there is the hardliner face, Parliament Speaker Qalibaf, who controls Iran's negotiating mandate in the formal talks, and who declared publicly that the U.S. is violating the ceasefire. His warning, "We have not even begun yet," is the statement of someone who believes Iran has leverage and is not finished using it. The UAE is perhaps the most exposed actor that does not get enough attention. A U.S. ally, a country that has sustained more incoming Iranian fire than any other nation over the past 2 months. It is now deploying an Israeli Iron Dome system, secretly positioned there since the war began, to intercept Iranian missiles. The UAE has condemned what it calls renewed treacherous Iranian aggression. It is also the country whose oil terminal Iran chose to strike on a day when the entire world was watching the strait. That target selection was a message. The UAE understood it as one.
4 missile alerts were issued across the UAE on Monday, the first such public alerts since the ceasefire began nearly a month earlier. Residents across the country were told to find shelter. Commercial aircraft bound for Dubai and Abu Dhabi turned around mid-flight. Schools across the country switched to remote learning for the week. The fire at the Fujairah terminal burned. 3 Indian nationals were wounded and treated. Fujairah is not a symbol. It is the UAE's lifeline. It is the terminus of a pipeline specifically built to allow UAE oil exports to bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely. When Iran struck Fujairah, it was not targeting a military installation. It was targeting an economic escape route. Off the UAE coast, the British military reported 2 cargo vessels ablaze. A South Korean ship caught fire after an explosion in the strait. South Korean officials have not yet commented on Trump's call for Seoul to join the military operation in the waterway, an invitation that, if accepted, would widen the coalition of nations directly involved in the conflict. Inside the Persian Gulf, hundreds of merchant ships remain at anchor. The sailors aboard have been stranded for weeks. Secretary Rubio's description, sitting ducks, isolated, starving, vulnerable, reflects a reality that has received almost no sustained coverage. These are not warships. They are civilian crews from dozens of countries caught inside a war zone with nowhere to go. And beyond the Gulf, the World Food Program has been clear. Food prices across Central and Eastern Africa have already risen 50% since the war began. 1.5 million people the WFP can no longer afford to reach. If oil stays above $100 a barrel for 3 more months, 9 million more. We started this video with a single question. Is the ceasefire already dead? You now know the military facts. You know the players. You know what is burning and who is stranded. But here is what most coverage is missing entirely. There is a factual dispute at the center of this crisis, a direct, irreconcilable contradiction between what the United States says happened in the Strait on Monday and what Iran says happened. And if the Iranian account is accurate, this crisis just became something categorically more serious than a ceasefire under stress. That is where we are going next. The most strategically significant reaction did not come from an adversary. It came from India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi issued a statement calling the targeting of UAE civilians and infrastructure unacceptable. That is not a routine diplomatic formulation. 3 Indian nationals were wounded at Fujairah. India is the world's 3rd largest oil consumer, overwhelmingly dependent on Persian Gulf crude. Modi's statement signals that a country which has carefully avoided aligning itself in the U.S.-Iran conflict may be reaching a threshold. Pakistan condemned the strikes while simultaneously serving as the mediating channel between Washington and Tehran. Pakistan's foreign minister reportedly requested that Trump pause Project Freedom, and Trump's Tuesday evening announcement credited Pakistan and other countries as part of his reasoning for the pause. Pakistan's position is extraordinary. It is simultaneously condemning Iran's military actions and serving as Iran's diplomatic lifeline to the United States. Saudi Arabia also condemned the strikes. Qatar pledged full solidarity with the UAE, meaningful given that Qatar was itself reportedly targeted by Iran in earlier phases of the conflict. Oman, whose territorial waters the U.S.-approved shipping lane runs through, reported that a residential building near the strait was struck, wounding 2 foreign workers and damaging 4 vehicles. China is the actor to watch most carefully. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi is traveling to Beijing on Wednesday, May 6th. Secretary Rubio publicly expressed hope that Beijing would use that meeting to pressure Tehran on the strait. The U.S. is essentially asking China, which has its own significant interest in stable Gulf oil flows, to deliver a message that Washington's own diplomacy has failed to deliver. Whether Beijing chooses to play that role or chooses to use Iran's leverage as its own negotiating chip against the U.S. is the pivot point of the coming week. The world's major shipping companies have not moved. Hapag-Lloyd's position is unchanged. Transits through the Strait of Hormuz are not possible. Commercial confidence, as one analyst put it, is the true center of gravity, and that confidence has not returned. Here is the detail that most coverage has not foregrounded, and it changes what you think you know about Monday's military exchange. U.S. Central Command said it sank 6 Iranian small boats that had been targeting commercial vessels. President Trump later said it was 7. Admiral Cooper said the boats posed a direct threat to civilian shipping under U.S. protection. Iran's account is different. An Iranian military commander disputed the entire U.S. claim. Iranian state media reported that 2 small civilian cargo boats were struck by U.S. forces and that 5 Iranian civilians were killed. These are not competing interpretations of ambiguous footage. They are mutually exclusive accounts of what happened on the same day, in the same body of water, involving the same incident. In the U.S. version, the Navy destroyed armed Iranian military vessels in a legitimate act of self-defense. In the Iranian version, the United States killed 5 unarmed civilian sailors and destroyed 2 cargo boats. There is no verified, neutral, third-party account. No satellite imagery released. No footage. No independent ship-tracking confirmation of the vessel's classification. Yet the U.S. version has been reported as fact across virtually every major Western outlet, while the Iranian account, including specific civilian casualties, has been noted in passing, if mentioned at all. This matters for a reason that goes beyond the immediate incident. Iran's negotiating position is that the United States violated the ceasefire by launching Project Freedom. If Iran can argue in Beijing, in Islamabad, in any international forum that the U.S. killed 5 Iranian civilians while claiming to sink military boats, Tehran gains significant diplomatic leverage. The burden of proof in that argument does not rest with Iran. It rests with Washington to prove it sank military vessels, not civilians. That proof has not been offered. What Qalibaf said publicly, "We have not even begun yet," may not just be a threat. It may be the setup for a counterclaim that Iran's next action is not an escalation, but a response to American aggression that killed Iranian civilians during a ceasefire. You now know the hidden layer. There is a factual dispute at the center of this crisis that gives Iran a potential diplomatic justification for its next escalation. And Iran's parliament speaker has already told the world publicly that the next escalation is coming. The question is no longer whether this gets worse. The question is how much worse, and what specifically would have to happen for it to become uncontrollable. Those are the scenarios we are going to map right now. And at least one of them ends with a conflict that China and Russia cannot stay neutral in. What is actually on the table here is not a ceasefire argument. It is the global energy order. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply. Before this war, roughly 120 ships transited it every single day. Right now, the number of ships passing through without Iranian authorization or U.S. military escort is effectively zero. Oil is already above $100 a barrel. Every day this continues, that price climbs. Every dollar it climbs adds to what consumers pay at gas stations, what airlines pay for jet fuel, what farmers pay for fertilizer, what shipping companies pass on to retailers, what retailers pass on to you. The geopolitical stakes are just as severe. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports has been in place since April 13th. Iran has not fully responded to that blockade. Qalibaf said so explicitly. If Iran escalates against U.S. naval assets or expands its strikes on Gulf infrastructure, including Saudi Arabia, which has remained quiet but is watching, the entire Gulf Cooperation Council becomes an active theater. The nuclear dimension has not gone away. Secretary Rubio stated explicitly that for peace to be achieved, Iran must agree to Trump's demands on its nuclear program and reopen the strait. Iran has not accepted either condition. If negotiations collapse entirely, the original reason for this war, Iran's nuclear program, remains unresolved, and Iran's nuclear infrastructure, damaged but not destroyed, may still be capable of reconstitution. On the human dimension, the numbers are concrete. 9 million additional people face food insecurity by summer if oil stays above $100 a barrel. 1,500 container ships rerouted away from the strait since the war began. Thousands of civilian sailors stranded in the Gulf. 3 Indian nationals wounded on UAE soil. And somewhere in the strait on Monday, 5 people may have been killed in an incident that no one in the Western press is asking the hard questions about. The best-case scenario, a deal reached this week through Beijing's mediation, requires Iran to accept conditions it has publicly rejected for 3 months. The likely scenario is a prolonged standoff in which the strait remains partially closed, oil stays elevated, civilian shipping remains paralyzed, and both sides continue calling it a ceasefire while fighting inside it. The worst-case scenario, the one that the "we have not even begun yet" statement opens the door to, is a full Iranian strike on Gulf infrastructure, UAE oil terminals, Saudi Aramco facilities, or direct hits on U.S. naval assets significant enough that Washington cannot absorb without a kinetic response. That is when other actors, China, Russia, Turkey, can no longer stay on the sidelines. The clearest analytical framing of the military situation came from retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, a former director of operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center. Schuster told CNN that the U.S. military is not playing man-to-man defense in the strait. It is playing zone defense. The key insight is that it does not matter how many Iranian boats or missiles are launched if they cannot penetrate the defensive umbrella. The zone holds or it does not. The counter-argument came from Seth Jones of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a former senior Defense Department official. Jones told CNN he does not believe the U.S. has enough destroyers, A-10s, or F-35s to escort large volumes of merchant shipping simultaneously. The more ships the U.S. tries to protect, the more risk it takes on. 2 ships successfully transited on Monday under U.S. escort. Pre-war volume was 120 per day. The gap between those two numbers is the entire problem. Torbjorn Soltvedt, the principal Middle East analyst at risk intelligence firm Verisk Maplecroft, was unambiguous about the commercial reality. This operation alone is not something that looks like it is going to open the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial confidence, Soltvedt said, is the center of gravity. Iran only needs to maintain the perception of risk to keep merchant traffic suppressed, even if it never fires another shot. On the food crisis dimension, Matthew Hollingworth of the World Food Program was the most consequential voice of the week. He placed the humanitarian cost of this conflict in terms no strategic analyst uses. 1.5 million people the WFP can no longer reach. 9 million more if oil stays above $100 for 3 months. 45 million additional people globally facing food insecurity by summer if the strait does not open. Those figures are not projections from a model. They are operational assessments from an organization that feeds people. The most alarming expert voice in this entire crisis is the one not from a Western think tank. It is Qalibaf, Iran's own parliament speaker, its own negotiating chief, who wrote publicly that the U.S. is in a situation it cannot sustain, and that Iran has yet to deploy its full arsenal of options. When an adversary's chief negotiator says that publicly, the analytical community takes it seriously. We started with a question: is the ceasefire already dead? Here is what you now know. Both sides say no, and both sides are shooting at each other. Iran's top negotiator has publicly declared this is not Iran's full response. Trump launched an operation and paused it the same day. 5 people may have died in the strait in an incident the Western press has barely examined. And Iran's foreign minister is on his way to Beijing tomorrow. The most important moment of this story has not yet happened. And that is exactly what makes the next 24 hours worth watching. Best case, Iran's foreign minister arrives in Beijing on Wednesday. China, which has its own enormous economic stake in open Persian Gulf shipping and its own diplomatic interest in being positioned as a responsible global actor, presses Tehran directly. Iran accepts a face-saving framework. The strait reopens under a technical agreement that lets Iran claim it was not coerced. The U.S. pauses its naval blockade, and Pakistan brokers a formal resumption of nuclear talks. Oil drops. Shipping companies begin cautiously restoring transits within 2 weeks. This requires every party to want the same outcome at the same moment, which has not been true for a single day of this crisis. Likely case. The pause Trump announced Tuesday evening holds for several days. Iran interprets the pause as U.S. acknowledgement that Project Freedom was a ceasefire violation. Both sides conduct parallel back-channel talks through Pakistan while continuing low-level military posturing in the strait. No major new strikes. No formal deal. Oil stays above $95. Shipping companies maintain their suspension. Civilian sailors remain stranded for additional weeks. The humanitarian crisis deepens without triggering a threshold response. This ceasefire in name-only scenario continues until one miscalculation: a ship sunk, a sailor killed, a drone that hit something it was not supposed to, forces both sides to a decision neither has made yet. Worst case. Iran concludes, based on the civilian casualty claim from Monday's exchange, that it has the diplomatic justification for a significant escalation. Qalibaf's statement that Iran has not yet begun is the public predicate for that escalation. Iran targets Fujairah again, or expands to Saudi infrastructure, or directly strikes a U.S. naval vessel with a weapon that does more than rattle the hull. At that point, the April 8th ceasefire is unambiguously over. The U.S. responds with force. China and Russia, facing a collapsing energy market and a U.S. military operation they did not sanction, cannot maintain neutral positioning. The conflict enters a phase that has no precedent in modern Gulf history. Watch these three specific things in the next 72 hours. Whether Iran's foreign minister emerges from Beijing with a statement indicating Chinese pressure on Tehran. Whether Qalibaf or any senior Iranian military commander issues new public statements escalating the civilian casualty claim. And whether the U.S. naval blockade shows any sign of softening as leverage in the talks Trump claims are making progress. I want to ask you two genuine questions, and I want your actual answers in the comments, not the obvious ones. First, Iran's parliament speaker publicly stated during an active ceasefire that his country has not even begun its response. If an American official said that during an active ceasefire, how would the world be covering it right now? Think about that honestly. Then think about what it means that this particular statement received almost no headline coverage in the West. Second, the U.S. and Iran have given irreconcilable accounts of the same military event. One says military boats. One says 5 dead civilians. No independent verification exists. In a conflict where both sides are fighting inside a ceasefire they publicly claim to be honoring, whose account do you trust? And what would actually change your mind? Drop your answers below. I read every comment on videos like this, and this is genuinely the debate that will shape how the next week of this crisis unfolds.
3 things to carry away from everything you just heard. First, this ceasefire is not a ceasefire in any conventional sense. It is a pause in declared hostilities during which both sides are conducting military operations, exchanging fire, and striking allied territory. The label is being kept alive because both sides need it, but the substance of it is dissolving in real time. Second, the humanitarian cost of this crisis is already catastrophic and almost entirely uncovered. 9 million people face food insecurity by summer if oil stays elevated. 1.5 million people the World Food Program can no longer reach today. These are not future projections. They are current operational realities, and they are a direct consequence of a strait that was never fully reopened after the ceasefire was announced. Third, Iran has not made its big move yet. That is not speculation. That is what Iran's own chief negotiator said publicly in writing on Tuesday. On whatever comes next, in the Strait, in the UAE, at the negotiating table in Beijing, is not the continuation of the current situation. It is the beginning of the next one. Watch Beijing on Wednesday. Watch whether Qalibaf follows up his statement with any new announcement. Watch whether Trump's claimed great progress toward a deal produces any documented evidence within the next 48 hours. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could determine whether this ceasefire survives or becomes the last one. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, the Jang Report will be the first to cover it. The Strait of Hormuz has been the line between war and its absence for 3 months. Right now, no one, not Washington, not Tehran, not Beijing, knows which side of that line tomorrow puts us on.